Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Lauren Hertel calling in from Florida, welcoming everyone to Working and Collaborating Remotely. We're going to wait just another minute and let any latecomers, any stragglers come on in to the webinar. But I did just want to let you know there are two audio modes that you can use with our webinar today. You can dial in using a telephone, or you can use the mic and speakers on your computer. If you choose to use the mic and speakers on your computer, we recommend using a headset. It just makes it easier during the question and answer period to hear your audio. If there's no headset connected, then we get some audio feedback and it can be tricky. But you can always switch back and forth between the two modes. If you're having trouble with your headset or with the phone, you can just use the audio panel in GoToWebinar to switch back and forth. Use the radio buttons labeled telephone or mic and speakers to use whichever form you'd like to use. Looks like we've got almost everyone here now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this is Lauren Hertel. Welcome to the Switzer Foundation webinar, Working and Collaborating Remotely. We will be covering a number of different topics today, but I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions and answers. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. There's a recording of the entire webinar, or there will be, there will be a recording of this entire webinar and a link to all of the links I showed during the web tour available on our blog in just a few days. If you'd like to follow the links as I go through them during the presentation, you can do so at delicious.com. There's a couple of ways to get there. I've included the URL here on this page, but if it's easier, you can also just go to delicious.com/Switzer Network and then look in our stacks and you'll find that there's one for the webinar, Working and Collaborating Remotely, which is today's topic. All of your microphones are muted for the time being, but we will be using the raise hand button both during and after the presentation if you have a question. I'm both presenting and running the webinar in the background today, so it would be easier for me if you don't use the chat box or the questions box. It's a little different from most of our webinars. If you do want to type a question, if for some reason you don't want to use the raise hand button, you don't have a headset or whatever, by all means, feel free to use questions in chat. Just know that I won't get to those questions until I've finished presenting because it'll be tricky for me to run both. So again, welcome. Let's go ahead and get into our topic. For those of you, I mean, we're all working right now, right? I'm sitting in Florida running this webinar. You all are spread around the country and probably the globe listening to me. So obviously we all know that work happens everywhere. It happens in multiple modes. It happens at multiple times of the day in multiple time zones on multiple devices and platforms. Sometimes that works really well. Sometimes that works not so well. But today what I'd like to do is cover some typical scenarios where you might find yourself working remotely or trying to collaborate remotely and look at some of the tools that you might use and some of the workflows that you can think about to get that work done most efficiently and effectively. Like I said, I do want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers because I'm sure even the scenarios that I've thought up, you all face completely different and different work challenges with your remote collaboration and work. And I'd like to get to those and hear some of your tips and tricks and also answer any additional questions I can about tools that are available. So work happens everywhere, but roles do change. And if you could just take a minute to think for yourself, how many of the following roles you found yourself in working remotely just in the last 5 years? I've put a few possibilities here. These are ones that I've actually found myself in the last 5 years in different jobs and at different times in my career. I've been a remote worker, someone who was working completely independently and remotely. I've been a remote manager, managing student groups at the University of Florida and also managing team members on big State Department grants. I've worked as a network team member. That's what I do right now, working from Florida for the Switzer Foundation, which, as you know, is based in Maine. I've been a project developer looking at individual projects that we could do. I worked for the Florida Department of Transportation on a project that was based in Orlando. And even though I just live a few hours from Orlando, it was probably 99% of the work I did on developing the project was done from my home office. And then just I tied in occasionally to the networked office in Orlando. In the scope of a 3-year project, I met with the team physically only one time. I've been an online entrepreneur, as many of you have been, either running a business or a nonprofit, and I've been a freelancer. And for anyone who hasn't fallen into one of these categories that I've mentioned so far, it's almost guaranteed you've been out of the office for more than 72 hours at some point in the last 5 years and suddenly found yourself in a situation where you had to work and network remotely. So there's a huge variety of possible roles that you could find yourself in. And these are just a few examples that I'd like to talk about. Also, just before we go any further, we had a few people log in a little bit after 1. I just wanted to remind you that you can use the raise hand button if you have a question during the presentation. You can also use the questions or chat box if you have a technical problem or a question for me. I'm just running the webinar on both ends today, so it might be a little bit of a delay before I get to a question that's posed in questions or chat. Hopefully everyone's audio is working well and video is working well, because we're going to jump into some of our examples. So here are just a few common situations that I've found myself in. I've been working almost exclusively remotely now for going on 10 years in a variety of roles, in a variety of situations for a variety of organizations. But these are a couple of sort of buckets that I've found remote work and collaboration tends to fall into. And once we go through these, I'd like to talk about some tools that I've found useful and that others have found useful to help in these situations. So the first situation we'll talk about is a large team, and by large I mean 20 or more people. For your organization, you might be talking about 100 or more people. Some of the solutions I'll show you work for institutions that have 20, 100, or even 5,000 workers. But large teams often need to share data and results across the institution and across institutions. And by that I mean within your organization, but you often have projects that have outside collaborators that you need to have access to data and contacts between institutions. And large groups often have to work across time zones. That's not at all unusual to work Eastern Pacific or even Eastern all the way across the globe. It's a 12 time zone difference. And you have to stay on track with some people working overnight, other people working during daylight hours where you are. There are good solutions for that. The second scenario that we'll look at is the small group. By here I just mean about 5 people, a small group of people that works remotely from one another on a daily basis, but you need to stay connected and feeling like a team as if you were in the same place. And that's a very common occurrence for nonprofits, for academic institutions, even just for small individual run businesses, entrepreneurial situations where small groups need to work remotely, but you need to feel like you really are working together on a daily or even hourly basis. Another example is an individual, a busy manager who works in the office and remotely as need be, but needs to offload some of his or her tasks to subordinates. And those subordinates might be direct reports. They may be people who work for you. They may be people who don't work for you directly, but are actually temporary workers or what are called virtual assistants. So we'll talk a little bit about what the virtual assistant movement is and how you can tap into that to offload some of your tasks and get things done more quickly. And then the fourth situation we'll talk about is an individual, a freelancer in this case, who works remotely with a lot of clients. And this is a particularly tricky situation because if you're working in an institution, you or someone in your organization can probably decide what tools you're going to use and just implement them. You can say, we're going to use Basecamp and everyone's going to use it. And the decision can come from the top down. In the case of a freelancer who works remotely with a variety of clients, he or she is usually not in a position to insist that a client learn a new tool. So the tools that he or she might use need to be simple, straightforward, flexible, and easily understood and tapped into by anyone of the clients that they may be working with. So we'll talk about that unique situation too, where you don't get to determine the top-down tool. You have to sort of work within the bounds of your clients or collaborators. So we'll come back to the presentation in just a moment. I've got some links here that I'd like to go through with you, but I did want to just call your attention once again. Let me go ahead and copy this URL. I'll put this in the chat window. If you'd like to follow along with me as we go through these, you're welcome to do that. The links in Delicious are not in any particular order. We'll be going through them in the order of the scenarios that I just mentioned. Before I go any further, though, let me go ahead and ask, are there any questions or is anyone having any trouble with their GoToWebinar setup, with audio of any kind? Anything at all that I can help with before we launch into the next part of the webinar. You're welcome to use the raise hand button. You can also use questions and chat because I'm looking at both of those right now. All right, I don't see any questions. That's fantastic. Let's go ahead and keep going then. So the first scenario I would like to talk with you a little bit about is this large team, this idea of 20, 100, 5,000 people that have a variety of projects that they need to work on together and in different combinations. Some people in one project, everyone in the team may need to have access to the same data. In other projects, you may just have 2 of your 20 or 5,000 people who need access to the data. There's a really good solution that I really like. It's called Basecamp, and I'll just show you a little bit about it. This is by a company called 37 Signals that is really, really good at cranking out incredibly useful cloud and networking collaboration tools. They themselves work remotely with each other. They're a software development company, and they do a really fantastic job of taking tools that they've created for their own team and then pushing them out to the wider market. So let me just show you a couple of features of this. They'll give you a sense of how this can work for you. The interesting thing about Basecamp is that you could actually build the individual components that comprise Basecamp in other tools. So for example, if you're already using Google Apps, you could easily build out a to-do list, a shared calendar, all of the different tools that you're going to see in Basecamp right now, you could build out using Google for free. The beauty of Basecamp is that they've done it all for you in one place. And so instead of having to log into and learn a variety of systems, your dashboard in Basecamp actually provides access to everything. So this is an example that you're just looking at a single project. It does have a dashboard view where you can view all of your current projects, but it gives you an overview of the project itself. Then it gives you a place to do discussions. So that's a very typical discussion board where you may have different things that you want to discuss and let people discuss in real time through chat, which Basecamp provides, or just as a static discussion board where people can post when they have something to say. There are shared to-do lists within Basecamp. You can see different sub areas where you might have different to-dos for people. You can assign to-dos to different people, leave comments on those. The other nice thing is that Basecamp integrates very well with additional tools. So, for example, if you are using an online to-do list to-do list manager already, like Remember the Milk, which we'll be talking about in just a minute, Basecamp can actually export your to-dos from Basecamp itself into Remember the Milk or Google Tasks or wherever you happen to be doing things. So it integrates quite nicely with other tools. You won't always have to log into Basecamp to check out what's going on. It gives you the ability to share files, which is a very useful thing, especially when you're working with people from outside of your organization on a project. Usually sharing files within an organization is pretty straightforward across the network, but the minute you try and share something with someone outside, you're looking at it using another tool like Dropbox or Google Drive. In this case, they actually provide you with storage within Basecamp to do that. And then just scrolling down a little bit further, it says it keeps all of your projects, data, and people in one place. And that is, in fact, the beauty of using Basecamp for projects. Now, I'll show you the pricing structure really quickly. I find that Basecamp is really the most useful thing to use if you're doing at least 10 projects. That's where they start with their pricing tier, is at least 10 projects at once. You get 3 gigabytes of file storage, and it's $20 per month. If you're only managing a few projects, it is actually probably easier to simply build something out in Google Apps instead of going for a bigger solution like Basecamp. But if you're a big organization or you have a ton of projects going on, this is really useful. So let's think for a minute too about the second scenario. The second scenario was that you've got a small group that really needs to stick together as a team. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of tools, but I did just want to cover briefly. There's some basic rules in a way, or guidance that I can give you when you're trying to run a team remotely and you want that team to feel like a team. One of the most important things is to have multiple methods of communication, and that can be everything including email, chat, instant message, a virtual conferencing solution like Skype group video calling, even using Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn to keep people with their information and their data flowing across the web all day long. There's a tendency, I think, in small groups for everyone to sort of hunker down, get a big chunk of work done in the day, maybe shoot off an email at the end of the day to let the team know what they worked on, and then be done with it. But it's actually kind of interesting that group teams have been shown, virtual teams have been shown to function better if there are multiple check-in points during the day. It's not to say that everyone has to get online and check in with each other, but if there's some sort of rotation that's in place, either whether it's scheduled or informal, to allow people to chat with each other regularly, it more closely mimics the work environment in a physical location like an office building, and it gives people more of a sense of being connected in and not working in isolation with just that quick update at the end of the day. One of the most important things, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in the webinar, but one of the most important things that you can do if you're working or collaborating remotely is to actually set aside time to do active team building. It seems like you might not need to, and in fact, one of the advantages of working remotely is you can often get more work done because you're not having all of those little distracting conversations throughout the day. But it's very easy to become isolated in your work environment when you're working or collaborating remotely. And so it's really important that teams set aside regular times, ideally daily, like I said, to check in with each other. And one of the great ways to do that is using Skype, or we'll talk about GoToMeeting in just a moment, using one of these online video conferencing services with a webcam. Now, of course, that means that one of the other big advantages of working remotely or from home or somewhere else is that you can often work in your pajamas. And as soon as you turn on your video webcam, you're going to have to take those off and put on something more businesslike, probably. But it is worth it. It's worth it to have a few minutes a day to be a little bit less casual and to check in with your fellow workers. Skype is, it's a tool that's been around for a long time. They've had some issues over time, but I actually still really like their service, especially now that they've got high definition video conferencing that's extremely stable. You can see a screenshot here. It actually allows you to do group video calling that's some of the clearest and most inexpensive video chat conferencing I've found. The other thing that's nice about Skype is that it tends to work very well when you're abroad. That's not true for every tool, but that is definitely true for Skype. So that's one possibility. I included a link to their business account information on the Delicious Bookmarks page. Another solution, which is one that we use here with Switzer, is the GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar services. They cost a bit more, but they're extremely stable, and they give you some nice features. Once you have a GoToMeeting account, you can use GoToWebinar and vice versa. So there's some really nice features within this. They've also just introduced what they're calling HD Faces video conferencing. And as you can see here, they've got an app for the iPad as well as every other device. So that's another nice aspect of GoToMeeting, is that they have really incorporated mobile devices and apps that keep things very stable and functioning well so that you can work no matter where you are with your device. All right, moving on to looking at an individual who's a busy manager and you're trying to figure out how to work and collaborate virtually. This particular scenario, I'm just going to focus on one very narrow aspect, but the idea of using a virtual assistant is actually something that spans any role that you might have, and no matter where you may be working or what kind of work you do. I did want to talk about virtual assistants because it's a topic that comes up sometimes, but I feel like it's not very well known that it's actually being used by very high level people and is actually incredibly secure. Whenever I hear virtual assistants mentioned, people say, well, how do you know if they're really going to do work well or steal your passwords? I want to let you know I've actually used virtual assistants for a variety of tasks. The main thing that I use them for is scheduling. When I have a trip, or recently, well, not that recently, but about 2 years ago, I ran a huge State Department grant where we brought in 18 journalists. They were with us for 6 weeks. We traveled all over the country. It was an enormous amount of scheduling that needed to be done. And a lot of it was needed to be done quickly across different time zones. The journalists were coming from all over the world. So we employed several virtual assistants in different regions, one in Asia, one in Europe, one in the West Coast of the United States, to help us with scheduling and just communications, just getting the data out to people and getting things onto our calendar and keeping everything running. And it's a very effective way and inexpensive way. We paid $12 an hour on average for our virtual assistants, but they did a huge amount of work in such a short period of time that we figured that we had saved, for the 100 or so hours of virtual assistants we used, we estimated we had saved about 350 hours of staff time that it would have taken doing the same tasks. And of course, we were bogged down with other things. So we probably wouldn't have gotten to do those tasks as efficiently. So virtual assistants are essentially, this is the website for the International Virtual Assistants Association. They have a directory, they've got some references and some good information here about how you can use virtual assistant services. But essentially what you're doing is hiring someone, an administrative assistant, or even someone with more training, who lives in your time zone or somewhere else and works remotely to get your work done. They vary in terms of cost and skill level. You can hire someone for as little as $3 an hour to do very basic work out of India. You can also hire someone for $100 an hour out of India or elsewhere to do high-level marketing presentation work, proofing, even drafting of documents. There are virtual assistants out there who have expertise and can provide you with services that are well above and beyond the staff that you can employ full time. So it's sort of like looking at temporary work, but instead of having them in-house, you're doing it virtually. And that's something we can talk about more if any of you are interested in the question and answers period. So I did just want to talk, that's sort of the big version of working remotely and offloading some of your tasks. But there's some really simple ways to do it too. And for some of you, you may find yourself emailing to-do lists around with assistants that you work with or with subordinates, or even notifying people by email of what you're working on in a week. Remember the Milk is a great online to-do system that allows for collaboration. That's why I picked this particular one to talk about today. You can develop individual lists and you can assign tasks to each other, so it works great as a team solution. You can also email lists back and forth through the system, so the original list stays within the system, and you can share that task list across devices and across participants. As you can see on the screen right now, it goes through the iPhone app. You can get Android. You can pretty much access it anywhere you like. And the particularly good part is being able to assign tasks to other people. So it's a great tool for teams that need to essentially farm tasks out to each other, or for managers who need to both assign tasks to subordinates, but also keep track of those tasks on a regular basis to see what's been done and what needs to be done next. So remember the Milk is a really useful tool. There are a number of online to-do systems. I think it's possible I've actually used them all over time, but remember the Milk is the one I come back to again and again for this, for task management across teams. All right, the last thing I'd like to talk about, the last scenario, and then we're going to go into your questions and tips, is to talk about a freelancer, someone who doesn't have the ability to choose the tools and applications and enforce their use with their clients. So ideally what a freelancer is looking for are tools that allow networking and collaboration and work across boundaries, especially institutional ones, that other people are already using or are so easy to use that no one will uh, raise a fuss about being asked to use them. I particularly like the Google apps for this. There's a couple of benefits that Google Apps has. First of all, almost everyone has a Google account at this point in some way, shape, or form, whether it's through their work or through a personal account. So when you're a freelancer working with people across organizations, Google is a great go-to or sort of default application to use because people are usually already using it in some way in their work or their personal lives. The other thing that's great, of course, is it's free. Google Apps for personal use is free. Here I'm showing you Google Apps for business, which does actually have a cost associated with it, but it's relatively low. So if you're a low volume freelancer, you can use Google Apps, the personal edition, and use it for free. If you're getting a bit bigger and you need some of the additional support that Google Apps for Business offers, you could always go with the Google Apps for Business version. I did just want to point out briefly, I'll just show you this too. We did a recent webinar about using Google Tools in your organization. So if you're curious about Google Tools and want to know a little bit more than what I'm going to tell you today, we've got the recording of the webinar available on the website on our blog, and you can go back and look at that and get pretty much everything you'd want to know answered about Google Tools and the different versions. I did just want to jump back for a moment though. One specific app that I think is really, really useful in Google is Google Sites. I think of this as sort of the baby version of Basecamp. If you're a big organization and you can afford Basecamp, by all means use it. But if you're a smaller organization or nonprofit or an individual, Google Sites allows you to build out websites that are remarkably similar in their function to Basecamp. So you can create, I'll just show you one particular example here. These are examples that Google has come up with. This is an intranet site, an organic city intranet. You can post reminders. You can have shared maps or other shared graphics. You can have shared schedules. You can have shared discussion boards. This is just a countdown timer. Just open this up all the way. You can see it doesn't look as pretty. It's not quite as pretty as using Basecamp, but there are all kinds of things. Here's the shared calendar. Here's an Excel spreadsheet that's being shared across users in this particular project. It's actually quite easy to set up projects and then just use them from there on. Here's a team project template or example. This is maybe a little bit better of an example. You can see it's got a project status. It looks at the milestones. You can track milestones with this. You can share files using this as well. There's a reference box. You can look at all the team members and see who's working from where and get their contact information. You'd think that this kind of thing would be quite hard to set up in Google Sites, but that's the beauty, is they've made it incredibly easy. You literally just drag and drop elements onto the page. So say you want to have a team directory like this, there's a gadget for that. You just drag and drop it onto the page and it has you fill in the information from there. You can see they've got a shared calendar, same kind of idea. You can just share your calendar across different team members. So it's extremely useful. Google Sites is extremely useful. It is free. It's just not quite as pretty or quite as easy as Basecamp, but free is good. We like free. The other tool that I wanted to talk with you about, and this really does span all of the scenarios that we've talked about so far. It's called Google Voice. It's very similar if you use Skype in numbers already. This is a very similar system. Essentially, you sign up for the service. It's free, again, with Google. You pick a phone number. You can pick a phone number in your own area code or another area code. In this case, you can see, whoops, this is actually my personal account. And you can see my phone number down there. That's my Google Voice number. It's been about 2 years now since I gave anyone anything but this number. This is the only phone number that I give out now. Essentially, the way it works is that you get your phone number and then, whoops, let me move this over a little bit. And then you can set your phones up to forward from that number. So if you have a cell phone, or if you have multiple cell phones, if you have your home number, your work number, you can basically just use this one Google Voice number, give that out to everyone you talk to, and then have the calls forwarded to all of your various phones. In this case, I only have my calls forwarded right now to Google Chat, but I usually have them forwarded to my mobile phone, to a home number as well, to a landline. You can add as many phones as you like. Another interesting feature actually about Google Voice is that it will take, when you get a voicemail, it will actually transcribe it for you and send it to your cell phone as a text message or to your email as an email, depending on how you set it up. You can also have multiple greetings for people who call. If you use Google Contacts in Gmail, you basically assign each contact to a specific group. So you can see in mine, I only have a couple. I actually have my personal recording, and I used to have one specifically for my mom and dad, but I keep it pretty minimal. In your case, you could have a list of business contacts, or if a number of people call you from one company all the time, you can have an update for that company's project on your voicemail. Anything that you wanted to do, you can set up separate voicemails for different contact groups. The other interesting aspect of Google Voice that makes it particularly good for working and collaborating online is that you can use it to make calls from elsewhere. So if you're someplace with Wi-Fi but without access to a phone, you can always dial in and have it call you back with the number that you're using. So in other words, you can sit in a hotel, tell Google Voice to call someone for you, and as soon as that person picks up, it'll connect it through to you. So you can make free phone calls from hotel phones using it. So Google Voice is really, for me at least, a one-stop solution to what I need to be able to do as a remote worker on a regular basis. I like to think of it as my one number to rule them all. And I, like I said, don't give out any phone number anymore except this 510 number, because I can have my calls forwarded to any number I like and also get my voicemail transcribed for me anywhere that I like. So again, just a reminder that all of these links that I covered today are available on our Delicious site. It's delicious.com, and I'll show you the basic, oops, in our basic website site, delicious.com, Switzer Foundation. If you go to the stacks, you can find links related to this webinar as well as our other webinars that we've been giving recently. So with that, let me go ahead and pause. I see we have at least one question here already. Let me go ahead and stop. And anyone, any questions or comments or tips or tools that you found that you think are particularly useful, we welcome them all right now. Let me go ahead and open it up to all of you for questions and comments. Oh, we have got one question here from Jim. Jim is asking if there'll be a brief summary of this sent to those participating. Jim, thank you for that question. That's a good reminder. The way we do it is you'll receive a reminder email afterwards that this presentation and all the links related to it will be on our website, on our blog in a couple of days. As soon as the webinar is over, I basically download the recording and clean it up. So it might not happen today, but certainly by Wednesday at the latest, The presentation and all the links will be available on our blog, which is switzernetwork.com, and then the blog link. Thanks for that question. So let me go ahead. I'm just opening up on my windows here since I had them closed because I was presenting. Let me go ahead and open up and see. You're welcome to ask your questions in 3 ways. You can use the raise hand button. You can type a message into chat, or you can also put a question into the questions box. Any of those 3 ways are great ways to go. Oh, we have one of our new fellows here. Hang on one second. Let me go ahead and call on you. Priya, this is Lauren. I'm going to unmute you and you can go ahead.
Hi, Lauren. Can you hear me?
Can hear you great.
Oh, great. Okay. I was wondering what you think of Doodle Pool for organizing meetings. I've used that, but I don't know if you have a recommendation for better software. Or...
You know what? I actually like it. I find it, so for me, it's always a question of paid versus free, and you always sort of have to juggle back and forth between those. Are they still doing it for free? It used to be free.
Yes, it's still free.
It's still free. So I really like it. I found it a little limiting. There's I believe, a participant limit, isn't there? Was it 6 people or 5 people?
I've used it for, I guess, 5. I don't think I've gone over that before.
Yeah, that was where I ran up against limits. I actually really liked it for limited group interactions. I thought it was really useful and very stable, which is often the problem with the free solutions for working and collaborating online. They're not always stable, but I actually found that to be a very stable tool. What did you like about it?
I guess being able to organize so many different people's schedules at once, although I've had a hard time convincing some people to try it. So
Mm.
you can usually get about half the people, and then you can narrow down where you're going with it and then go to the other people personally.
Yeah, that's a sort of a trick that I find. You'll notice that a lot of the tools I recommended are sort of the industry standards. I always like to find a free tool and then an industry standard tool that's usually a paid version. It can be very tricky. Actually, we'll talk about that in just a minute too. It can be very tricky to get people to come along with you and use a new tool. Most of these collaboration tools have made their sign up and new user practices very easy. They realized over time that they can't be asking people to do a million different sign up procedures and make it really hard. So many of those tools actually have a procedure by which new users don't even have to sign up. You can just join in the meeting or join in the collaboration, and that tends to work much better. As I remember, that tool is one of the ones that had that. So that's I thought it was great. I actually don't have a better suggestion for a low limited number of users for a free tool.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Ruth, you had a question? Let me go ahead and unmute you. I saw your hand was raised for a minute.
Oh, no, no, I decided not to ask it. Well, it relates more to not necessarily to professional class. Well, it does. The challenge I'm finding, and I'm wondering what others have advice on, is sort of this separation. In my case, I work full time, but I sometimes do work outside of my employer. And I'm wondering what advice you have on sort of separating professional, well, both of them are paid work, but one sort of is your employer who you're on their beck and call, and the other is for collaborations outside of that official full-time paid environment.
I think that's a good question. Um, in terms of tools, or just in terms of how you split that and make sure you're not stepping on the employer's toes?
I think there's both.
I think so too. I mean, it's
I mean,
so.
and it actually your example of the Google reminded me of it because one of my colleagues set up a Google account for me because he wanted to be involved in using it because of it was superior, and yet my employer really pushes, and I've put everything into an Outlook format because within my organization, Outlook for scheduling and a lot of those things is, has all of its um, um, formats. So then the question becomes, how do you put the pieces together?
Mm-hmm. And that's it. So I'm going to take a stab at that, but then I'm definitely going to open it up to other people because we have other academics on the line as well as folks who are having to deal with that, I'm sure, by juggling their sort of main business and then sidelines. First of all, I would definitely recommend multiple accounts. So in the case of a main organization, with Google you can have multiple accounts, no problem. You can even be signed into multiple accounts at the same time. So if you're working for, say, a university, having a Google account that is Ruth University or Ruth Work or whatever it needs to be, that you can always give to people at that institution if they want to sign you up for a Google group or if they want to do a collaboration. A number of universities are actually moving into using Google for education. Google's made a very strong case to universities for data security and privacy. And I see Margaret had a question about that as well, about privacy and security, especially around student data. Because that's a huge issue at universities. So the first thing would be to check with the university and see what other tools they support. This is just random that I happen to know, since Ruth and I both worked at UF. UF actually does support, through IT, they support Google tools for education. Most departments don't use it because they don't have anyone familiar with it. But the university itself actually encourages and supports the use of Google tools for a huge number of projects. Because Outlook's mostly email and scheduling, but it doesn't really have that group project support functionality built into it very well. So the first thing is to actually check with the employer and find out, like, what can we use, what's available, what would you allow, what would be okay. And then beyond that, I would definitely recommend having multiple accounts, no matter how many. If you're a freelancer for the government, if you do contract work for the government, have a Google address for them, or a set of passwords and logins for that client. Have a set for your actual job, and then actually it's a pain, but dance between those accounts, because you don't necessarily want to be sharing that data across the organizations. Let me go ahead and open that up, though, to anyone else who might have some input on that. If you've got some input or some advice for Ruth on that question of how you juggle these multiple clients and come up with a workflow that would work across them, go ahead and raise your hand if you would. I'm not seeing any hands raised. It's a tough one. The biggest thing is finding out what each client already works with and is comfortable with, and that may actually resolve part of the problem right there. What I have found working with large institutions is that they often have solutions available that only the IT department knows about. So only the computer folks on campus know what all the contracts that they have signed with outside vendors. And you may find, for example, I'll just go back to the University of Florida again as an example. The University of Florida has an institutional contract with a company called Illuminate. Illuminate is a fantastic online collaborative solution for teachers, professors, for students, for learning. But because the contract is institutional at the University of Florida, you can use it for any kind of collaboration that is related to the university work at all. So basically anything related to your work as a professor, you could use Illuminate, and that immediately solves your problem for teaching online, for running online meetings, for running training webinars. Illuminate can do all of those things. And that's one that many universities have signed on with. So if you're in a big institution, it's definitely worth talking with the folks to see how it works. Oh, Ruth is saying Illuminate's not in effect. They replaced it with something in Sakai. You're right. The Sakai solution is actually basically did replace the Illuminate functionality. But it's another good example of where there is a tool available that they don't really publicize that well. Often big organizations don't publicize that well what contracts they have. Sharon, you had a question. She says, I don't have an audio mic, so I'm typing. It's not about collaboration so much as managing multiple contacts. She says she's using office time to track her work on multiple projects, but it's her first attempt at using software for this. She's wondering what people use and appreciate to manage and track their time on multiple projects for multiple clients. So I'm actually not a good one to answer that question because I use a very basic spreadsheet. I actually use a spreadsheet for Switzer as well as for any other client I work with. I find it's easier when I'm working with multiple clients to use the very simplest technical solution that I can. And in my case, that is a Google Docs shared spreadsheet. So I just keep track of how many minutes I worked, what project bucket it fell into, and what the actual tasks were that I completed. And then I share that spreadsheet with the client and anyone else who needs access to it. I like that solution just because spreadsheets are something that everyone has seen and used at some point. When I use Google, I can share that spreadsheet as a view-only document with people outside of my domain. They can be on any domain. They don't have to have a Google account if I just share it as a read-only. So that's my solution. I'd be curious to know if anyone uses something other than that. If you're tracking time for clients, by all means, I actually do like office time if your clients are willing to go along with you on that. I usually try and keep it simple because I don't want to have to explain a new system to new clients and how I work and how I do my time. Oh, Sharon's saying thanks. Well, if anyone has another solution that they really like, I would love to hear about that. Prius has a question. You said you often find yourself going back to Remember the Milk. Sure, I can go back and talk a little bit more about Remember the Milk. So let me get out of this for a second. So this is the main page for it. Let me go ahead and let's see. I don't know where they actually put all of their benefits and how they work everything. I've been using this for so long now that I don't know how to navigate through to the help status anymore. Here's the Getting Started guide. So this is a good example. So they give you a couple ways to do things. You can divide things into individual lists. You can see here you've got this person just has personal, study, and work set up. But there's an inbox and also sent. And that's really useful if you're sharing your to-do lists across different organizations or across different people. Essentially, you can send people to-dos, or they can send you to-dos. You can also share your lists with other people so that they can work on them. So that gives you just a sense. There's different tasks. You basically put your tasks in. You can set priorities, due dates. You can even add locations if there's a specific location where a task needs to happen. You can also add time estimates. That's really helpful because if you put in your time estimates and then you total up your day, you can see like, wow, I've got tasks that I expect will take 9 hours and I only have 3 hours to do them. So you can see immediately that you have a problem with that. You can set reminders. So you can get the reminders via text message on your cell phone. You can get them via email. You can set up specific numbers for specific. You can set multiple reminders for to-do lists. You can see all of that's set up right here. You can do searches to find different things. You can find who your tasks are shared with. You can find your shared tasks. That's that shared with section right there. And then it's got a whole section on doing more. But the sharing part is what I really like. So you can see right here, you've got status and then shared with. You can set up specific people to share your lists with. So if you work closely with one colleague all the time, like if you have a research partner, you can put all of the tasks into one list, prioritize them together. And then as each of you has time, you can work through that to-do list. You can set up a to-do list for someone that you set for them to receive at a specific time, receive the reminder. So say you have a colleague that you're working with, or even maybe your spouse, you want to remind to go grocery shopping, you can actually set a specific list of tasks to be sent to their text or their email at a specific time of day on a specific day. You can also send those to yourself. So if you know that you're going to be sitting in an airport for a while with nothing to do, you can set Remember the Milk up to send you a list of airport tasks, things that you can get done while you're sitting in the airport waiting for the next thing to happen. So that's actually, I think, a really useful system. If you wanted to know more about it beyond that, by all means, just type me in another question and I can tell you more about that. So let me see if we have any hands raised. I just want to take a quick break from questions and go back into the presentation and talk about a couple of not really tools per se, but a little bit more along the workflow question that Ruth was asking about a minute ago. Because I think, there are the tools and then there's the lifestyle. And I think it's really important to think about both. I mentioned that I've been working remotely almost exclusively now for about 10 years. Somehow, no matter what job I do, I always find a way to end up doing a lot of it from home. But there are a lot of things that there are a lot of things I've learned for me personally over the years of working remotely. And maybe some of these things will ring true with you and get you thinking a little bit about the how of working remotely instead of just the tools. One of the things that I have found to be absolutely critical when you're working and collaborating remotely is that you actually have to be mindful of communicating. And by that, I don't mean be mindful of what not to communicate, but actually be mindful to communicate. It's, like I said at the beginning, very easy to get into a pattern where you work remotely all day by yourself, or even sitting in a Starbucks, but you are not connecting with your coworkers and your boss as often as you probably should be. My rule is generally if I'm feeling a little lost, then I should have doubled my communication in the last 24 hours. It's really important to be timely with your communication when you're working or collaborating remotely. Make sure that the person is getting the communication from you when they need it. So if your boss likes to have an update first thing in the morning, then that's when you need to be scheduling your updates for that person, whether it's a check-in via text message or email, or even just a quick Skype call to say, I'm in the office, I'm working, here's what my plans are for the day. Really important to be timely with your communications so that the person you're reporting to is getting it at the right time for them. Sometimes that means taking into account the time zone changes, the time zone differences. It's important to be proactive with your communications. Again, I think it's really important, especially if you're working in an organization that is not very savvy yet with remote work. I think it's really important to be proactive and come up with policies for yourself that you follow, that you're regularly communicating with those people that you're separated from. Find out what they prefer, how they prefer to receive the information, whether it's an update on Facebook or a quick Skype chat or whatever it is. How do they prefer to receive your updates? When would they like to receive them? And then do it religiously, because it's very easy when you're working or collaborating remotely to fall into the out of sight, out of mind trap. And that's not good for anyone's career. Not good for anyone's career, not good for anyone's sanity if you're working remotely with others. So really important to be proactive in your communications. I think it's important to be informal. This seems unusual, but for most of us, when we work in an office, all of our communications are not structured around, you know, dear boss, here is a list of tasks I'm currently working on. That's not how we talk to each other in person. And if you were working with people in person, you would be very informal with them in that you would joke around a bit, you would ask how they're doing, you would share the information you need to share, you talk about the news, you talk about the weather. It's important to find a way to do that online as well. If all of your communications with your teammates are of the more formal email nature, you end up not feeling like a team. You end up just feeling like an appendage that works remotely and not like a real member of the team who is working with other human beings. And that can get tough when push comes to shove and there's a deadline. If you don't have that rapport, then working remotely can really, really be difficult when you're under deadline. And I think it's important to be clear. This, no matter what method you follow, everybody knows that you can say something in email that comes across completely wrong from how you meant it. That's true with every communication in working and collaborating remotely. So I've found myself having to really work hard on this. I think this is where my biggest challenge is to be really clear about what you're saying, why it matters, what you need next, and how you'd like to receive it. Those are things that in an office setting kind of work themselves out more easily, but when you're working remotely can really be a disaster if you're not clear about it from the beginning. A couple of other things that I've learned is improve constantly. Don't ever stop improving. I think it's really important. I always set my goals daily, but I set them at 5 p.m. for the next day. This is probably something I would do in an office anyhow, but what's particularly good about doing this is that you then can email them early or send them in a text or just have them ready when you first fire up your computer. I think it's just really important to start your day knowing ahead of time what you're going to do. Because working remotely, it can just become a little bit too amorphous, especially if you work from home and you're tempted by the laundry, stove, refrigerator, pets, kids, name your distraction. I think it's really important to know the day ahead of time what you're going to be doing the next day so that you sit down and get it done first off. I think it's important to review your time monthly. Oops, excuse me, didn't mean to switch. I think it's important to review your time monthly and make it visible. This goes back to the question of Sharon's question of how to record time. It's critical to record your time. I think it's critical to record it by the minute. If you spend 15 minutes on something, call it 15 minutes. If you spend 20 on something, call it 20. If it's 105, call it 105. And each time you start a discrete new task, put it down on that spreadsheet to track your time. And then review that time monthly to see if you're being as effective as you can be. I used to think that I needed to work in a public space to work more effectively. I liked the noise and the sound around me. Turns out, although I don't like working alone at home, I'm way more efficient at it when I do it at home. So I'm much better at sitting and working for 6 hours from home in the peace and quiet and then going enjoying the coffee shop for an hour afterwards than I am sitting in the coffee shop for 6 hours and only getting half as much done. And I think it's important to make that work visible because even if you're working for someone who is used to working remotely with people and having subordinates who are working remotely, you want to make clear for yourself and for them that you are getting it done. This is one of the biggest challenges to convincing organizations to let this happen. Study after study after study has shown that people get more done when they work remotely. But managers still don't believe it. If they can't see you working, they don't believe it. So if you can make it visible in a spreadsheet or some other kind of time tracking device, it's worth it. I think it's worth it to tweak your workflow and your tools quarterly and implement the changes you come up with. So Sharon, whether that's switching from office time to a spreadsheet, or Ruth, whether it's coming up with multiple accounts and using them, I think it's really important to look quarterly at the tools you're using, the workflow you're using, and find ways to improve it. There's I don't know why this is, but somehow in offices it seems easier. Maybe it's because you're looking at your coworkers, you're seeing them move in and out, seeing things get accomplished. But I think at home it's very easy to fall into a pattern, or if you're working remotely to fall into a pattern. And most of these are new for us. Once you start working from home, you'll suddenly say, well, I can work at airports. And then suddenly you're working in hotel rooms, and then you're working in coffee shops. And those are all very different challenges. So I think it's good to also think about your workflow on a regular basis and see ways that you can improve it. There's always a way to improve it. And then the last tip I would give is that annually, make sure you're reviewing the entire working remotely, collaborating remotely arrangement that you're using, whether it's formal or informal, written or unwritten, and make sure you are considering that arrangement in your annual review. Maybe your annual review, what you'd like to do is do more remote work or less, or have different circumstances for it, or maybe you need some equipment to help that arrangement work more cleanly and smoothly. I think that that's all valid fodder for your annual review, and it's worth looking at your system annually to think about it. My last bit of advice is never work in a cave unless you can make it a party, and that's really more tongue in cheek. Never ever work in a cave. Do not isolate yourself when you're working and collaborating remotely. I think it's the number one pitfall that you can fall into. You can sit at home or sit somewhere else and get so much done without those interruptions, but those interruptions are what make work happen and what make it spontaneous and make collaboration exciting and fun. So you don't want to become a cave dweller who only works and doesn't ever get to collaborate. Finally, if you're fighting a losing battle, it's sort of a topic for a different webinar. But if you feel like you're fighting a losing battle at work, you'd really like to collaborate and work more remotely, or you feel like your institution isn't supportive of it, but you know that you could do it, or you think a virtual assistant could be really interesting, but there's no way your boss is going to go for it, I would definitely encourage you to either post in the comments on our blog if it's something you are willing to post publicly, or feel free to email me privately. And I would be more than happy to give you some tips and suggestions for how you can kind of pull bosses along. It's such an individual process that I didn't want to sort of do a blanket treatment of it in the webinar, but it's an important one. It's something definitely worth thinking about. Again, just a reminder that our recordings are available at the switzernetwork.org blog. There's the website for it, and you can also get information about fellows and upcoming events at Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, or you can email me directly at lauren@switzernetwork.org. That's the end of the presentation, but we still have some time left for questions. So let me go ahead and jump back. And if anyone has some additional questions, I would welcome them. This is one from Priya. She said it's a bit off topic, but still related to communication. Do you have any recommendations on website design software for beginners? Interesting. Someone recently suggested Serif. I've heard of Dreamweaver is more powerful but difficult to learn. Interestingly, Priya, this is actually totally related to our topic today because people who work and collaborate remotely often find themselves having to set up websites to get that work done. This is not unusual or off topic at all. So I used to teach multimedia journalism at the University of Florida and had to teach website design to folks. Ironically, I've never heard of Serif. I actually don't know what it is. I've been out of that line for a few years, so it's possible that it's new. I can definitely tell you that you do not want to go to Dreamweaver. Dreamweaver is the most advanced tool out there for website design, and although there are some simple ways to use it, you will get so bogged down so quickly. It would just make your head spin in what you'd need to know to set up a site in Dreamweaver. I guess my basic my basic advice would be to think about what the site needs to do. If it's a basic collaboration site or even a very basic info site, sort of to say, this is the research we do, here's how to get in touch with us, you can actually use Google Sites for that. You can set it up in Google Sites, and there's a way to basically assign your own domain to it. So you would go to a domain host, claim your domain, like I own laurenhertel.com, or Switzer Network has switzernetwork.com, the foundation does. You can buy that domain. Usually it shouldn't be more than about $10 a year to register it. And then you can actually use a service like Google Sites. There are a couple of other ones. I'll write myself a note and post those on the webinar notes that you can use, and then basically just tell the computer, say, okay, I've designed my website, but instead of using your URL, like Google Sites dot whatever, I want to use my URL, right? And call it whatever you like, laurenhertel.com or Switzer Network, whatever the domain is that you purchased. That is by far the easiest way to get it done. The second easiest way, ironically, is through a company called Elance, or a website called Elance. Let me get out of this presentation and I can show you the Elance website. This is kind of like using a virtual assistant in a way, but Elance is a place where freelancers who do different kinds of work basically bid their services. So you post the job that you want done, and then people bid on it, and they tell you, what their skill set is. What I find particularly good about Elance, you could literally get a website designed for $50, depending on how complex the website is. The time and expense that it would take a non-expert to come up with a basic website is enormous, where someone who is a web design expert can do that in half an hour or an hour because they have the software, they have the skills. So Elance is actually really good for some things, not so useful for other things, but you can see the most popular skills on here are programmers and designers. So perfect. If you need a website designed, I would actually highly recommend looking for someone at Elance. You can read ratings of people. So if you're just looking for a basic website, you can say, type that in as the search parameter, basic website. People will come up. You can look at their ratings. You can actually look at the jobs that they've completed and people's feedback about them. For literally $50 or $100, you can get a bang up website designed, launched, all the content ready to go, and not have to kill yourself over it. And if you want something done in like Google Sites so that you can continue to edit it afterwards, that's of course the next step. Once you have the website up, you want to be able to edit it. So if you want them to use a content management system that you can edit easily, like Google Sites or some of the other ones, then you can actually specify that on Elance. You can say, need a basic website set up in Google Sites, bid the contract and go from there. There are people from all over the world in Elance, so that the rates tend to be extremely competitive for different kinds of work. So I hope that helps. Any other questions? And Margaret, let me actually just come back to you for a second, because you had asked about data security, and I didn't really cover that completely. I sort of covered it on the side with Ruth. So Google is extremely secure, and especially Google for Education. That's how they've been able to convince universities to use their tools. Every university is different, though. So my suggestion would actually be to talk to the university IT department, not your college or department IT department, but the university level IT department, and find out what services they're prepared to let you use. You might be surprised that Google's among them. When it comes to other services like Basecamp or some of the other ones, that can be a little bit trickier. And then you're starting to talk about paid solutions, which usually the university is not so keen on. The alternative, and this was actually something that I did when I worked at the University of Florida, is I did all of my virtual office hours using Illuminate at that time. There are other solutions now. I did a lot of virtual office hours using Skype and my webcam. I did an enormous amount of student project collaboration work using Basecamp and some of the Google tools, but I always kept grades separate. And that's something that's probably also worth saying when you're talking about working and collaborating remotely. Even if a client says, oh, no, we can't share any of our data that way, you can often find pieces of the project that you can do virtually with tools that are at your disposal. It's usually not all data that's secret, unless you work for the government and doing top secret work, and they have their own systems set up for that. But you can often find pieces of the puzzle that you can do virtually. So what I often had some of the stuff that I did, I had to work with graduate students and they were grading remotely. I would have them do a spreadsheet, and then that translated easily into the grades database, but I would actually move the database over myself to not, so that there was no question about data security. Or I'd have graduate students grade different parts of things so that the full grade was never in any one place except the secure system that the university sponsored and used. So there are some ways around that, but I think that your individual university's data IT system or folks are the best place to go for that because it does vary so widely. Any other questions? Looks like we're out of time. I do hope that this was useful. It's a big topic, hard to exactly cover it for everyone in all situations in an hour, but I welcome individual emails at lauren@switzernetwork.org. And I hope that you will pass this link. We'll be posting the webinar in a couple of days. Please feel free to pass this link along to folks and take a look at some of the resources that I've posted on Delicious. If you have additional tools that you like, I'm happy to add links to our Delicious account. We're always looking to build that out as a resource for fellows. So if you have tools that you like that you're using, I would love to add those to our Delicious list of links for this webinar. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for attending, and we'll talk to you soon. And welcome again to the new fellows. I was really happy to see a few new fellows on the call today. Bye.